Hi, I'm Dr. Fred Opie, the founder of Food Prof Productions. Welcome to this Food Prof download of the Breaking Bread podcast. For information on Food Prof conditions of use, visit fredopie.com. And now, enjoy the podcast. NECEA is a nonprofit educational organization that provides valuable resources and support for individuals, schools, and organizations with an abiding interest in the ceramic arts. I delivered a keynote address to its members at its national conference in 2015 in Rhode Island. What you're about to hear are excerpts.
We hope to bring into focus over the next few days some conversations about clay's intimate connection with food and the seamless integration of taste, touch, and material as artfulness in our daily lives, that is ceramic art. Fred Opie is a professor of histories and foodways at Babson College. He's the author of several books, including his two most recent ones, Upsetting the Apple Cart, Black and Latino Coalitions in New York from Protest to Public Office, and his brand new book, Zora Neale Hurston on Florida Food, Recipes, Remedies, and Simple Pleasures. Fred will be signing his book after the talk this evening and again tomorrow morning. So I'd encourage you that if you enjoy what you hear, to get outside and have a conversation with him and bring home his book and continue thinking about some of the depth of research, consideration that he's given to this topic. Fred's also the editor of the blog foodislens.com and is a contributor on the radio show The Splendid Table that many of you have heard on NPR, as I did when I first had heard Fred's voice coming to me in West Virginia. In addition to his academic career, Fred is also an accomplished athlete. He's included playing on the lacrosse team at Syracuse University. Go Syracuse, go Orange. And he was also part of a World Cup team with the U.S. men's national lacrosse team in Perth, Australia in 1990. Believe it. He's excited to be here, delving with us into the ancient history of the links between food, beverage, and clay objects through a look at Aztec, Maya, and Inca societies before 1492, 300 some odd years before the lively experiment started here in Rhode Island. So get ready to explore with him the questions that drive this year's keynote address. Who made earth and cooking and eating and drinking objects? What status did their artisan crafts give to them? How did their work become distributed or exchanged? Who used ceramics to cook and serve the beverages? What foods and beverages did they make? Thank you, Fred, for being here.
Well, good evening. You look more awake than my 9:45 class this morning. I want to thank your organization for inviting me for many reasons, but probably most important to me is that you have made something that I have taken for granted for a long time. I have become so fixated on food and food traditions that I often forget the importance of the objects used to cook the food and to serve the food. You probably are familiar with the book by Ralph Ellison, The Invisible Man. And I'm embarrassed to say that until I was invited to come speak to you, that's pretty much how I have treated ceramics as a scholar. And now I have my eyes open and I see ceramics just about everywhere. You know, we had to replace my wife's car about 3 years ago. And everybody knows the experience when you decide you know what you want. What happens? You begin to see it everywhere. And that's how it was with my wife's car. My kids would go, "Daddy, there it is. Daddy, there it is. Is that the one we're getting? Is that the one we're getting?" Well, that's how I am with ceramics after being invited here. I literally see ceramics everywhere, and it's opened up just a whole new vista of looking at food and thinking about food. So thank you very much for the invitation to come out and speak to you all. I'm going to do a presentation, nothing like the one we just saw, which was fantastic, folks from Kansas City. And I know this organization is a very savvy one, because if I was planning the next location, I would want to go to one of the best barbecue cities in the country. So, very smart move. Okay, so we're going to talk about earthenware and talk about it in the context of what I call First Nation people. And I want to do it in a way that's dynamic because it's the kind of presentations I enjoy. Here is the capital of what became the Aztec Empire. My Nahua pronunciation isn't very good, but I call it Tenochtitlan. This is the capital city of the Aztec Empire. And key to understanding this empire is that, first of all, as you will see in the next image, that it's built upon a waterway. And some of you could understand the importance of being close to a waterway in your own craft. So ceramics certainly played an important role within the Aztec Empire, but even more so within the capital city, which functioned as the metropole for the Aztec world. This is by no means an egalitarian society. This is a society that's built on what we call cooperative relationships with those who are considered among the Aztec elite as lesser groups who bring tributary to them. And part of the tributes that they bring to them is certainly ceramics, as we will see. So if you look at this image here, this is the city that was built up over many, many decades to become the head or the capital of the empire, and it is the current location for Mexico City. But there are causeways that cover all these bodies of water, and no doubt along the shores of these water were probably the places where people would harvest their clay. The first part I want to ask you or talk to you about is who actually makes the clay within the Aztec world, the Maya world, and Inca world. Well, we know within Aztec society, and by the way, this is a mural by Diego Rivera, and it's a great way to show you some of the dimensions within society and how they relate to ceramics. So how do you know who has status within the Aztec world as well as the Mayan and the Inca world? Well, one way you know is by clothing. And if you look around, you will see the elites tend to have bright colors. It's the same thing with their ceramics as well. Their ceramics are much more ornate than a commoner would have. If you look at elites, if you can see them, you'll notice sandals. By the way, this is Frida Kahlo, if you haven't noticed. Diego manages to put Frida in just about everything that he would create. But elites tend to have huaraches or sandals. Non-elites tend to be barefoot. Elites have, I said, bright colors. They tend to have things like earrings, all kinds of artisan crafts that speak to their culture. They also had sumptuary laws, laws that dictated what they could wear, what they couldn't wear. They had sumptuary laws that dictated what they could drink and what others couldn't drink. So all these go into talking about ceramics. So we do know within Aztec societies that the craft of making things out of clay, first of all, was a male institution. It was certainly a male institution. We have no scholarship to show women involved in the making of ceramics. We also know that it is commoners. This is not something that an Aztec elite would be participating in whatsoever. So that's one thing we know about who actually made it. Within the Aztec world, the artisans that produce ceramics, they tended to have more than one job. They would be farmers and artisans who would make pottery. They would have many different jobs. Now, what's interesting is I spend a lot of time around living museums, and if you look on Instagram and look at the photos and images I have there, you'll see some from old Sturbridge Village, which is on the border of Massachusetts and Connecticut. And they have a beautiful rendition of a potter's barn, a kiln, and the whole bit. And when you talk to the interpreters in the potter's barn, that was not a full-time job. It was something that you were a farmer and a potter. You were somebody who did something and also you did pottery. Well, it was for the most part the same way within the Aztec world. you had more than one job. And this is going to be different when I talk about the Maya and the Inca. Another example of the hierarchies within society, again, as I said, the clothing, the mask, all these things are examples of, I guess, what you would call bling Aztec style. And part of the bling Aztec style was also the vessels that they ate off of and that they drank from. All those have to do with status within Aztec, Inca, and Maya society. Similarly, when you have a guest come, I know in my house, we have probably 2 or 3 sets of dishes. So you have the paper cups, plastic cups, you have everyday cups, and then you have Thanksgiving Day ceramics. I have 2 platters that came from Mexico. I did all my language training in Mexico, so if some of you are thinking back there, why is this very tall African-American man talking about Aztec culture and society? Because for me, I spent so much time in graduate school in Mexico, it very much feels a part of my culture and society. And one of the things that I would do when I would come back from Mexico is I would buy all kinds of ceramics. So we have 3 beautiful ceramic platters that we use for parties at our house. And the only time they come out is for a special event. Aztecs were the same way. There were the everyday type of consuming vessels, and then there are the special occasion ones. Now, if you're an Aztec elite, the ornate ones are everyday vessels for you. If you're a commoner, the only time you're breaking out the night stuff is on a religious holiday or a ritual. So it's very similar to how we look at vessels today. How did the creations of artisans become distributed? First of all, an artisan did have a great deal of status within Aztec, Inca, and Maya society because you were commissioned by a member of the nobility to produce something, and your association with that nobility gave you status. The ability for you to make a vessel that would impress a guest of that nobility also gave you status. What we knew, though, within Maya society, we're going to talk about them in a second, is that artisans signed their creations. So they not only signed it with their names, but they signed it with the names of the people who commissioned them to make it. And so it was definitely a sense of status. People looked at artisans very much like gods. People who could take nothing, clay, from the shore, bring it to their homes, bring it to their workplace, and make it a living creation. So they were held in very high esteem. We also know within Aztec society that an artisan were one of the few people within society that were literate. They could read cosmology. They could study all the most important parts of their science, and they were considered people of high status within their society. So how did their creations get distributed? Well, one of the ways we know is this is a marketplace right here. There are some commonalities we know between the Aztec, Maya, and Inca, and say ancient societies in Africa, West and Central Africa, which I also study. And we know that the marketplace was a place for women. Local trade was carried on by women. Trade in ceramics by women. Long distance trade tended to be a male occupation. So here we have women selling all kinds of goods, but they're also selling ceramics. They're selling food and they're selling ceramics. Now, this is not just any woman, these are commoners. You wouldn't see an elite woman selling goods in the marketplace. It's an occupation of a common woman, of an entrepreneur. So we know that their goods travel locally within the marketplace. But it also, anytime you had a guest, and my wife, is a Southerner, anytime we go or invited to somebody's house, she is just programmed to, we got to bring something. Well, in Aztec society, it was both you brought something, and very often it was an ornate piece of ceramics, but you also gave something, an ornate piece of ceramic. And we'll show you some examples of that as we go along. But it was a way of creating relationships with people and maintaining political alliances. So therefore, that artisan meant a lot to you as a political leader because your leadership and your alliances depended on how much you could impress your guests. So certainly that piece of ceramics meant a lot to political leaders within Aztec society. What do we know about what people made on top of, inside of, and served with ceramics? Certainly the most important aspect of the culinary history of the people we're talking about today is corn. The Aztec and the Maya are known as people of corn. In the case of the Maya, what they would call their creation story comes out of what's known as the Popol Vuh. And the description of the creation story is gods or the gods making a human being from a lump of corn, from masa. That is the corn that's ground down and then made into, almost like a potter's clay. So if you look in here, you will see pictures or depictions of people grinding corn into masa, okay? You see a woman stirring. There's a good chance that what she's stirring could be chocolate, which is an important part of Aztec culture and society. Very different than the kind of chocolate we would think about now. On the way in, I had somebody randomly handing out chocolate. If you got one of those chocolates, can you raise your hand so I can see you? And you know you're supposed to share, all right? That's from the Taza Chocolate Company, which is based in Somerville, Massachusetts, not far from here. But what you see with chocolate is a special occasion food, again, associated for having a guest, a wedding, a political alliance, or a religious festival. And chocolate within Aztec and Mayan Inca society is not sweet. It's a savory, spicy substance, and it's not consumed as a solid, it's consumed as a liquid. The ability to take your chocolate and make a froth like you would a latte was something, if you were going to impress your guests, the bigger the froth, the more impressive the guest would be. So it's a very different sense. We don't have sweetened chocolate until after 1492, when Columbus on his second voyage brings sugarcane from the islands off of West Africa and introduces those sugarcane plants to the Caribbean, and then sugar takes off. So there's no such thing as a sweetened candy bar within Aztec Maya Inca society. It's what we call a Colombian exchange that happens after 1492. There are many varieties of corn within all these societies. And every variety has a different use, a different taste, and it's used on a different occasion. One of the most interesting culinary creations, and it is a delicacy within Mexican society to this day, is a certain corn. They let the fungus grow, then they harvest the fungus and they cook it and they use it in a dish. If you talk about corn, there are just so many different ways, probably as many ways as we use hot dogs. I was listening to a show on NPR yesterday where this cook came up with this delicious savory dish that was barbecued ribs with sauerkraut. You're going, how could that work? It works. Well, fungus on corn, it works. Often scholars talk about the diet of the Aztec, Maya, and the Inca as the three sisters. The first one of the sisters is corn. The second of the sisters is the bean. Black beans, red beans are indigenous to the Americas. Corn, indigenous to the Americas, and an integral part of their foodways. So you would see a lot of descriptions of the Aztec, the Maya, the Inca, taking beans and consuming them in many different ways. The concept of beans has as many different interpretations as far as culinary taste as the corn. So that's the second triad. And then the third trinity within the three sisters is squash. Squash is indigenous. Pumpkins, squash, all those are indigenous to the Americas. You can see the original plant begin in the Americas, and it's an important part. So all these dishes would be prepared at that time using ceramics, ceramic pots, grinding them down, taking the seed from the squash and using those, grind them down into different powders, toasting them, making them with spicy things. One thing's interesting, if you spend any time in Mexico, I'm not a person who grew up liking a lot of spice. My wife and my kids, they have to have hot sauce on everything. That's not me. But when you live in Mexico, the weather is so hot. One of the things you notice that the children, and everybody, but particularly notice with children, when you buy street food like peanuts or something like that, all the street food that is sweet usually has some cayenne pepper or something really spicy hot on top. And you're looking at these people like, well, what are they doing? This is crazy, right? Well, it was crazy, but after 3 months, guess who was doing it? And what I found out is in every society that has a hot climate, people consume spicy food. Why? because it causes gastrointestinal sweating, which cools your body. So that's why you see people who come from hot climates consume a lot of spicy foods, and it's the same you see among the Aztec, Inca, and the Maya. Tomatoes, not part of the Trinity, but an important part in American plant. And you see salsa, green salsa, red salsas as a very important part of what you see the Aztec consume. It's a diet high in corn, a high in beans, and then the topping of the condiment will also be some type of tomato-based salsa. Again, green tomatoes, salsa verde, or you'll see red tomatoes. And mushrooms. Mushrooms an integral part of their cuisine as well. Foraging has become a boom industry with many high-end restaurants throughout the United States. But that was just a way of life among people during this time period we're talking about, whether it's in the Americas or you see same thing among people in West and Central Africa. Foraging these things, the ability to go out and know mushrooms not only for consumption but for medicinal properties as well. So this is another important part that you would see within Aztec society. Some of the best tacos I've ever had actually in Mexico has been a mushroom taco. Now, the Mayan Empire is very different. There were several different empires. There never was so much a capital city, but several capital cities. But one of the things we know about the Maya is that they're probably known more than anything else for the detail in their ceramics. When you consumed your chocolate drink within Mayan society, it was often you did one-on-one. In Russian society, it's considered bad manners and even a sign of senility if you drank alone. When it came to chocolate consumption, it was the same thing you see within Mayan society. The seeds within the cacao would be ground down, and then they would be mixed, and you would have the salt or the chilies added to it, and then it would be mixed in and served. When I think about my time in Mexico, and I stayed with a host family for many different summers, the image that I have in my mind is always a clay pot at the back of the stove percolating with beans on it. And it would cook this for hours and hours and hours. If you're a Southerner, that pot would be full with collard greens. If you're from Mayan society in Mesoamerica, it's going to be full with different beans. So that's one of the things that you see here. Now, the same pot, when we get to the Inca, and also among the Aztec consumed an alcoholic beverage called pulque. Again, pulque used in religious services as well. Chocolate often was a fermented drink, but pulque would be a beverage that was made from a plant somewhat as far as its relationship to agave. But it's one of these drinks. Pulque you see among the Aztec. Among the Maya, you see alcoholic or fermented chocolate. Among the Inca, we'll talk about chicha, but all made in these large ceramic vessels. And then what are they served? They're served in, again, here's an example of what I'm talking about. You come visit me, you're a high-ranking official, or you're somebody who I need your political alliance with. I present your dish to you. In the case of the Maya, most importantly, they're going to be serving you tamales, all different type of tamales. But they're going to serve it in a dish like this. And the dish is going to be served to you, and probably that dish will go home with you. The more courses that are brought out, the more prestige and status you have. How do I determine my status? Imagine the artisan sitting off to the side as the dishes come rolling out. Yeah, that's one of mine. So those are things that you would see. But this is a vessel that may have been produced simply for a specific visitor coming, for a marriage, at the birth of a child, at the death of a ruler. It's not that commoners didn't consume chocolate. It's not that commoners didn't consume tamales. But what made you different was the quantity and the quality and the frequency with you had access to the type of chocolate that you were drinking. Who produces? Who are the artisans within Inca society? And how are the vessels used? The Inca Empire goes from modern-day Ecuador all the way down into the region of Argentina. It's the biggest of the three empires we'll talk about today. What's key for the Inca is their supply chain. Along their way, they created a highway system that allowed their empire to have a thriving trade system. And along these highways, well, the Incas also had armories. But what was kept in those armories were actually stores of potatoes. And during a time of famine, how they curried favor with you as a local leader is when you needed that food, they would roll it out, and the expectation was when they needed you to roll out militarily, you would come out for them. But throughout their empire, they had these stores of freeze-dried potatoes. Another thing that you learn about the Inca is that there's not just a potato, it is potatoes. All different sizes, produced and cooked in all different ways within their culture and society. And from the Inca, the potato has spread out all over the world. Now here's an image of an Inca noble. Again, if you're on Instagram, you can see a little bit more detail that I put of this image that's on Instagram. But here you see ceramic vessels, and they're marked with the word chicha. So this is the kind of containers. Chicha made within Inca societies, a couple really interesting things for it. Number one, every one of the vessels that was produced to make chicha was commissioned by the Inca state. Now, wouldn't you love, as people in the ceramics field, to have all your clay delivered to your house? No more hauling that stuff on your back, but delivered to your house by the state. But there's a catch, that every one of the vessels has to be made to the Inca dimensions. So they produce every one of the containers, males within the society. There are communities which are established strictly for producing these ceramic vessels for making chicha within Inca society. Number two, which is interesting about chicha. Chicha is a corn-based beer, and it's the work of women. And there are women who are chosen, and for the remainder of their life, when they're chosen, they're responsible for making chicha. They take the corn, they masticate it in their mouth, and then they put it into these containers, and it ferments. And they have to do that in large numbers. So there are villages throughout the Inca world that produce these things. Produce the vessels, there's communities dedicated to producing the vessels, there's communities dedicated to producing the chicha. And chicha is shipped by the state throughout. Now, why does the state have such involvement in the production of the ceramic vessels for chicha and the production of chicha? Because within the Maya world, they have what they call the Mita System, M-I-T-A. It's a labor system. And it's a requirement that within this system, for 2 to 3 months, you will leave your community and you will do public work for the Inca state. It could be constructing or repairing one of the highways, or it could be housing for Inca. When you did this work, you were given beer. That was like your salary. So you can see the importance of producing this chicha, because if you don't produce the chicha, you're going to have a labor strike on your hands, or probably a rebellion. Some takeaways from this. First of all, I would say the most important thing is to keep in mind that ceramics are a male production within these societies, all three societies we're talking about. Number two, the production of food and beverages is a female occupation within these societies. You have a great deal of status when you can make these vessels within these societies. The more elaborate your painting, your creation, the more prestige you have as a person. So certainly to be somebody within these societies who did ceramics is you're a person of high status. And if you could pass that trade on to people within your family or in your community, you also had a great deal of status. That's the first one I would say. So when we talk about who made it, it's men. When we talk about the status, very high status individuals. Certainly not nobles. We don't see any noble within those societies, but we see close relationship between the nobles and the artisans that make these earthenwares. How did their work become distributed? Within local markets, and then they were shipped throughout the empire. One of the things I didn't mention is cacao was also a currency within these societies. So when you were going to purchase something like ceramics in a local market, often you would do it with the exchange for cacao. If you were purchasing something, you could take a ceramic good and use it to exchange for something you wanted. So that's, we know, long distance trade and local trade. These things were handed out as gifts and brought back to different people's communities. And who cooked and served the food? It's women. Distinctively a female thing, and it's among the commoners. Just like today in society, if you have a whole lot of money, more than likely, you're not going to be producing your food. You're going to have somebody who comes to your house and produce your food. Same thing we see within all three of these different worlds, the Aztec, Inca, and Maya world. And what food did they make? We talk about the Aztec. It's something that's corn-based. It's something with a lot of chilies. It's something with the three sisters. We talked about corn. beans, and squash. There are also many animals that are consumed within Aztec society and fish. One of the things that we know about Aztec society is the ideal of consuming not only things like mongoose, but things also like dogs. These were all part of consumption. The turkey is indigenous to Mesoamerica. That's something else you will see. So meat is consumed, but keep in mind, there is no pork, there's no hog yet, that's 1492. There is no cattle, that's 1492. There is no goat, that's 1492. So all these things are changes that happened to the culinary worlds of all three people after 1492.